Good morning, friends. Today we have a very interesting subject from our friend Roger Sturge, who titled his book Quaker Work in Germany in the 1930s, The Dilemmas in Facing an Evil Regime. Sounds fascinating. Roger.
Thank you, Ray. I think probably most friends would know that Quakers were fairly active in Germany in the 30s, but I think there's quite a lot of background to that which isn't clear. Um, British and American Quakers were both very active in Germany and at home in response to the Nazi rise of power in 1933. But I'm asking the question, what motivated this activity and what led them to be in a position to respond quickly? And then, of course, what the dilemmas and challenges were of that involvement. So once involved, how does a small religious body with a vital witness to truth, to the equal value of all human beings, the divine spark in every person, and to rejection of violence as a means of resolving conflict, meet the pressures on its members and their neighbors from a totalitarian, racist, militaristic regime, almost as opposite as you could think? How does it react to the excesses of that regime without aggravating the existing tendency in Britain and America to anti-German feeling, still lasting from the First World War? So I think we might look at how Quakers were in a position to respond in the way that they did to the developing situation in Germany in 1933, given that the only involvement of Quakers in Germany prior to World War I had been the isolated and short-lived Quaker groups, which existed first in the 17th century as a result of the early Quakers' missionary activity, and then late in the 18th and early 19th century, when there were two fairly well-settled groups, but which neither of which survived. One of them had a meeting house at a place called Bad Pyrmont, southwest of Hanover, but that meeting house fell into disuse, as did the burial ground at Bad Pyrmont. And in the early 1890s, the meeting house was sold. So by the time of the beginning of the First World War, there were no Quakers in Germany, no Quaker involvement, as far as we know. So the question is, how did they come to be there in 1933? Well, from 1919 onwards, they began to get very involved. And I suggest that they were motivated by three broad strands, closely linked because they emerge naturally from the Quaker instincts aroused by the Great War. For simplicity's sake, I'll label them as relief, reconciliation, and religion. I'll try and explain what I mean by some of those terms. Very briefly, in 1919, the dire conditions in Germany, Hungary, and perhaps worst of all in Austria resulted in a flood of Quaker volunteers, mainly from Britain and America. This was because of the blockade and the general deprivation during the war. The blockade continued until after the Versailles Treaty, and then, of course, reparations and sanctions were imposed, and we'll come back to that. But if I say that in Germany, bread tended to have an awful lot of sawdust in it, and children could only get milk on prescription, it's as dire as that. Many of these Quakers who descended on Germany and Austria had experience of relief and reconstruction during the war in the Friends War Victims Relief, the Friends Ambulance Unit, and the American Friends Service Committee, or, as in my father's case, with experience of working with distressed aliens, Germans, Hungarians, and Austrians suffering internment or harassment in Britain. They were eager to provide relief and perhaps to demonstrate the possibility of reconciliation between warring groups. Quakers were not the only relief workers. The founding of the Save the Children Fund by Esgline Jebb and her sister was very much a response, particularly to the famine in Austria, which was so acute because the country had Vienna was sort of almost on its own, having lost so much of its agricultural land to the new nations that emerged from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The main thrust of the child feeding schemes by Quakers in Germany was funded by US aid administration. So there was quite a lot of money available, fortunately, but it was under the Quaker Herbert Hoover was the head of it, and he was amenable to AFSC taking responsibility, but he did insist that it was managed by the Americans and not by the British. So in the early days, the British Quakers focused on a separate scheme, working mostly with students. But that changed, and already there were Quakers working for the American scheme, my father among them. He worked for the feeding scheme in Cologne and Opladen. The presence of men and women coming to provide succor to the enemy, particularly at a time when the Versailles Treaty had loaded the stigma of war guilt onto the German people and the burden of reparations, unsurprisingly, attracted some interest. This was particularly true from those with a left-leaning political stance. Remarkably quickly, those Germans who came to understand the nature of Quaker worship, and not all that came in the first place did, tended to think of it as a platform for oration, but they tended to drop off as it became clearer what it was about. And these more committed Quakers established worship groups around the centers of relief activities. And extraordinarily quickly, by 1925, these local groups were strong enough to join together to form German Yearly Meeting. The central religious function of Quakerism, the sharing of our religious understanding and testimony, had joined the emphasis on faith in action. British and American friends continued to support the German Yearly Meeting spiritually and to declining extent over the years financially up until the Second World War. Relief work continued in varying degrees and form of activity as circumstances changed. Famine in the early days after the signing of the peace treaty, destitution at the time of the Great Inflation, and unemployment relief when the world depression hit following the 1929 World Wall Street crash. But in the early 20s, another element was introduced. A man called Carl Heath, who joined Friends during the First World War, had a vision of Quaker embassies, later to be called Quaker centers or international centers. And some of you will be very familiar with the international center that existed in London. There's still one in Geneva. These centers were set up around the world, and Carl Heath was the secretary of the newly founded London Yearly Meeting Council for International Service, later to emerge with Friends Service Council in 1927. It merged with the Foreign Friends Foreign Mission Association to form the Friends Service Council in 1927. In Germany, relief depots became the focus of centers, particularly in Berlin, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg, the main one being the Berlin Center, and that became the base for the senior Friends Service Council and American Friends Service Committee representatives in Germany. A similar center was established in Austria, and while this had close ties with German centers, it was administered separately until after the 1938 Anschluss, when Austria was absorbed by Germany. If you're interested in the rather checkered history of the Vienna Center and the Vienna Worship Group, it is very well written up, and I recommend Sheila Spielhofer's book, Stemming the Dark Tide. So, 1933, we already had a small, scattered, but very active German Society of Friends. It had a publishing operation and a library and a meeting house at Bad Pyrmont because it had managed to reacquire the site, though it was actually given a different site, and it rebuilt the meeting house, moved what was left of the old one onto the new site, and built what is now Bad Pyrmont Meeting House, the one meeting house in Germany that isn't a rented property. The yearly meeting was ably led by its long-standing clerk, a man called Hans Albrecht. Seems to have been a very powerful character. And also, friends still benefited from the widespread memories among young adults of the life-saving feeding program over a decade earlier. There was an established center in Berlin with experienced senior AFSC and FSC representatives in charge and outliers at Frankfurt and Nuremberg. And an international secretariat. The grand name was actually a regular meeting of the AFSC, FSC, and yearly meeting representatives, which maintained contact with British and American appointees and between them and the representatives of the German yearly meeting. So it was an important sort of joining together, a consultation group. And in London, there was an established bureaucracy within Friends Service Council to select and support Quaker workers and to oversee their operations. American workers were similarly supported by American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia. So when Hitler arrived in power, the Quaker machine was remarkably well prepared for the great challenges that developed in the subsequent 6 years. So let's take those three strands I mentioned earlier. Let's take religion first. The German yearly meeting was a remarkable outcome of a very Quakerly brand of outreach. Its origins were in the principle of let your lives speak, rather different from the existing Quaker missions in Syria, Pemba, India, and China, which stemmed from the end of the 19th century when Quakers were more evangelical and more committed to mission. The German yearly meeting arose from this more modern Quaker approach of not going out and preaching, but making oneself available and trying to live a Quaker life. And it seems to have been very effective. The yearly meeting seems to have been self-starting. It continued to receive spiritual and financial support from British and American friends, but was determined to emphasize its autonomy and German culture. And Hans Albrecht, the clerk, who I've mentioned, the priority was the survival of German Quakerism. Made it very clear to friends that they were essentially a religious organization, not responsible for humanitarian aid. And most important, they had no intention of undermining the government of the day. Any friend who felt called to take part in acts of resistance must make it very clear that they acted alone and not on behalf of friends. And that's fairly important. It's understandable because the position of small religious bodies was very vulnerable in a state where churches were registered. And the Lutheran state church was broadly supportive of the Nazi regime. But friends, in spite of their opposition to the regime, survived not only the development of the Nazi regime, but also the subsequent war. Sorry, trouble with my script. There we go. Yeah. Sorry, I'll start again. I'll catch up somewhere. Sorry about this. I have a printing problem, so I haven't had a chance to check this. Here we are. Got it. Right. As one commentator put it, the other resistance movements were destroyed by the Nazis, but the Quakers survived Hitler. Their resistance was covert, if you like, but and non-violent, and they survived. If you're interested in following up the German Quakers in this period, I recommend a wonderful book by a man called Hans Schmidt, who attended the Quaker school in Ommen in the Netherlands, which was set up in the 30s to provide education for German children excluded from education in Germany. And his mother was a house mother at the school. He then became an academic in America. And his book, Quakers and Nazis, is well worth a read. It's an exciting story. So the question, the dilemma is, was Hans Albrecht's line of keeping a low profile, concentrating on the religious function of the yearly meeting and the worship, and distancing himself from not only any attempts to undermine the government, but also from humanitarian aid. I mean, that didn't stop the international friends being involved with it, but the German yearly meeting was not. Was that an undue compromise? Was it totally honest? So there's one of the questions, one of the dilemmas to be faced, and I'll come back and I'll pick those up later. Let's turn to relief. Relief, while the need for material support remained, in 1933, of course, the focus of relief work moved rapidly from sort of material support to support for those persecuted for their political record and, of course, for their race. Many of these included a number of Quakers who lost their position, some of whom had difficulty in accessing their pensions. And some were imprisoned in the concentration camps, particularly pacifists and social democrats were political prisoners. And the concentration camps were rapidly set up in 1933 and soon became notorious. One area of the work of the Berlin Center, which turns up in the accounts of the representatives' work, was visiting political prisoners, seeking to have their conditions ameliorated, and where possible, seeking their release, sometimes successfully. No Quakers were imprisoned before the war. Quaker Catchpole was arrested for 24 hours, but that was because of a misunderstanding, and he was very soon released. He was only held in the police station. But during the war, some Quakers were imprisoned, including Brenda Bailey's father, Leonard Friedrich. Assisting political dissidents and Jews emigrate became an increasing part of the role of the foreign workers. In the case of FSC, supported in London by the resuscitated German Emergence Committee, the one that I mentioned earlier, which had worked during and after the First World War to provide succor to enemy aliens living in Britain or caught there by the onset of war. And this became the Refugee and Aliens Committee and played a large part in obtaining visas for refugees from Germany and in the acceptance of the Kinder Transport children. Acceptance and placement, of course. Being recognized as a purveyor of humanitarian aid required friends to make it very clear that they were not in the business of overthrowing or undermining the state. Again, that dilemma. So the question is that neutral stance tenable? Was it honest? Only a small proportion of the persecuted could be helped. Would trying to achieve regime change and save them all have been a better thing to do? So another of the dilemmas. Finally, let's turn to reconciliation. Both of these strands necessitated maintaining working relations with Nazi officials, and that seems to have been Quaker Catchpole. He was the FSC representative from 1931 to 36, so crucial beginning of the Nazi period. That seems to have been Quaker Catchpole's particular gift. He always treated the German officials with respect, which obviously would be a good tactic when trying to get someone out of prison or the situation of a prisoner ameliorated, but it clearly was not just that, it was instinctive for Korda. That was his personality. Towards the end of his time in Berlin, Quaker Catchpole went out of his way to support Nazi members of the German community in the area around Memel, now Klaipeda in Lithuania, many of whom had been imprisoned by the Lithuanian authorities, and also organizing relief for distressed members of the German communities in Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which of course had big political implications. Korda would have seen this as a natural expression of Friends' belief in the spark of the divine in all people. Not all Quakers have seen that in the same light, and there has been some criticism in the literature. Related to that is the dilemma expressed by Bertha Bracey, who was the secretary of the Germany-Holland Committee and then of the Refugee and Aliens Committee. A remarkable woman, and I'd love to learn more about her, but her energy seems to have been quite extraordinary. Some of you may have seen the film or read the book of the Windermere School, which was set up in 1945 to accommodate orphans from Theresienstadt. Well, they got there because of Bertha. She went and banged on the door of the Air Ministry and said, I want 10 planes. And she got 10 bombers, which were converted to bring 300 children over from Theresienstadt. Quite an achievement while the war was still going on. So, she was a very remarkable person. Anyway, she was the secretary of the Germany and Holland Committee in the mid-30s, and then moved over and ran the Refugee and Aliens Committee. Played a big part in kinder transport. When after the World War II, she asked, were we right to play down the atrocities we saw when the Nazis came to power, to avoid aggravating anti-German sentiment in Britain? One writer goes as far as to characterize this position as aiding appeasement. Certainly a major preoccupation of Friends was to avoid war, and I think we would all applaud that. But it does raise some moral dilemmas. So the question is the appeasement accusation justified? Were they right to play down the atrocities, or was there more covert resistance to the value of the regime seen in their practical activities, the right use of their talents and resources? Right, well, that's my introduction, setting the scene, I hope, for you for some discussion. Let's start to see if there are any questions that anybody has about the account I've given. Is there anything that anybody doesn't quite understand or would like extended or clarified before we move on to have a close look at some of the dilemmas? Remember to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Roger, Marion here.
Yeah. Hello, Marion.
So am I right in thinking that actually that German Quakers weren't so much involved, that they weren't involved in kind of helping Jews escape and things like that, but that the other groups of Quakers from the UK and America, they were doing that kind of work, but that the Georgia Quakers felt they couldn't.
No, I can't give you an absolute answer to that. As a body, they weren't. But I suspect that individual Quakers, well, I'm sure that individual Quakers were very active, and would be active on a personal level. But they had to be very careful to make it to be clear that it was something they were doing, and it wasn't an official function of the yearly meeting. That's my understanding. It's a hypothesis which my research, I hope, will help me to check. But that's certainly how I see it. But I really need to go back. It's a long time since I read the Hans Schmidt book, and I'm looking forward to reading it again to clarify that for myself. It was I haven't explained to everybody that I'm actually doing an MA on this. My main sources are at Friends House Library, the Friends Service Council archives and minutes, and of course some of the literature. So I will be looking at that to try and make sure that I've got my understanding of that is sufficiently nuanced, because I don't think it's likely to be a very straightforward question. Thanks, Mariam. Thanks for raising that. That's very helpful.
Roger, Tony here.
Hello, Tony.
Hi. Roger, the release of Nazis by the Lithuanians from prison
Yeah.
Were they then under house arrest, or were they allowed to go back into Germany and continue?
I don't know. I don't know. I haven't. That's an area that I haven't got to yet in my research. So it's another one where I'd have to reserve that question. Uh, I know that some of them were released as a result of Claude's activities, but I think probably they just went back into their community in Memo. Because they were the people who were in prison were mostly the sort of the community leaders. And I mean, whether they were free to travel back to Germany, I don't know. But they lived in, the German community had been living in Memel for a long time, so it was very much. There were quite a lot of German families lived in the Baltic states.
Yes.
A very dear friend of ours was her family had been lords of the manor, as it were, in Latvia since the early 18th century. So it goes back quite a lot. They're very well settled, which of course disappears completely with the war.
Okay.
Any other questions before we move on to the acute question of the dilemmas? Well, maybe other things will come up as we're discussing it. Hi, Hattie, didn't see you there. Right. So let's go back to the questions I asked. I'll find them. Though, first of all, the position of German Quakers. Was their neutral stance the right approach? Was it truly honest? No, that's not quite the one. That's not quite the one where I'm because of my printing problem. Things are all over the place. So, yeah, yes, it was that. What was Hans Albrecht's line? A compromise? Was it totally honest? And it was it certainly seems to have been something that he had the strength of character to impress upon the yearly meeting to make sure that the yearly meeting didn't put itself into danger. And the question is that right? Was it an honest and totally honest thing to do? So over to you. Don't forget to unmute if you want to make a contribution.
I think the situation there is, for me, would be the difference being able to be not doing anything and being removed because you kind of stood up and made statements, or to stay that way below so you could help some others. Better for one man to go free than phrases like that. But that is my opinion.
Hattie, unmute.
Yeah, I rather feel that that's what I would do as well. I sometimes think I'm a soft touch and that I'm not sticking to my basic principles.
You've gone muted again. That's better. You're unmuted now.
Oh, right. Sorry. I think I would do the same as Ray, really, because I think that I do sometimes think that my principles are rather wishy-washy, but the person in front of me actually comes first in the end for me. That's how I am.
I'd like to throw something into the mix there. I haven't seen it. Well, I'll be looking at it in December, but the German archivist has a file containing the papers relating to Quakers from the Gestapo. And while the sort of newspaper cuttings are fairly rabid about the Stürmer has some nasty things to say about Quakers as being the humanitarianism being a front for the American Jews and things like that. But the actual Gestapo papers indicate that the Germans were very cautious about any attacks on the Quakers. And there are two reasons for that. One of the one I've already mentioned, which is, of course, the fact that so many young Germans owed their lives to the Quaker feeding schemes, and that was still remembered, and sometimes was very useful in negotiations with Gestapo officials. But the other thing was that they were seen as having a lot of influence with the British and American governments, and Germany was very keen to avoid aggravating Britain and America because it wanted to be, it didn't want Britain to come into the war that was inevitable. But of course, French didn't know that. They probably knew about the feeding scheme effect, but they didn't know about the written attitude of the Gestapo. Okay, right. I think we're probably fairly well agreed that the German yearly meeting line was probably the right one for a small religious group. They didn't have much choice but to do it that way. It didn't stop individuals taking actions that they considered appropriate or were called to, but the position of the yearly meeting had to be this neutral religious focus. And okay, thanks very much. That's very helpful. Let's move on to the questions relating to relief. And I think the focus here is on Quaker Catchbull's approach to the relief of the Nazis. And Nazis who in Lithuania and in a slightly different situation in Sudetenland, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And I still haven't studied it in detail, so I can't give a very full account of it. But the question is, was Quaker Catchbull right to go out of his way to be supportive to the Nazis who'd been creating trouble for the Lithuanians in Memel? That was the first question. Is the neutral stance tenable, and is it honest? Some good question. Chris.
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult one. I mean, I assume they didn't end up being tried as war criminals.
Sorry, who?
Sorry?
Who?
The
who
Nazis.
Didn't get? Which Nazis? The ones in
Lithuania.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That he helped get released.
Yeah. I don't know what happened to them.
No. So
that community disappeared in the war.
Right. Sorry, this happened before the war, did it?
This happened before the war. This happened in 1936, yeah.
Right. Okay. So
35, 36.
Yeah, but I mean, yes, it's one of the things that I've thought about a bit more in recent years is, of course, the great displacement of Germans after the war.
Indeed, yeah.
And particularly things like reading Christine Tollerton's father's memoirs, and how wonderful they thought these houses that the Germans had been thrown out of at the end of the war were, lovely places to live.
Indeed.
Yeah. Which and he was a member of the Polish resistance, and you kind of tend to think a good chap and think, well, it's very difficult. I'm glad I don't have to make these moral decisions.
Right.
But,
Very fortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of thing would have happened to the Lithuanian, the Memel Germans at an earlier stage. I mean, the one I know, of course, is this family that I mentioned earlier who lived in Latvia. They were driven out of Latvia by the Soviets in 1918. Our friend Adelina's father and brother were both shot, and she and the rest of the family escaped to Germany, and she became a very close. Well, I think she probably was already a close friend of my mother-in-law, and she settled in Heidelberg, and I think one of her brothers settled in Frankfurt. I'm not sure, but they were able to go back in the mid 1920s when Latvia became independent, and but then, of course, come the war, they were driven out again. Whether they were driven out by the Soviets or by the Germans, well, probably they were driven out by the Soviets, and they then had to return to Germany. But that would have happened early in the war, early in the war in the East, which of course started later. Than the war in what became the Soviet Union happened later. But they would have been scattered. So, but where to, I don't know. Whether they got involved in war crimes, of course, is quite another matter. That would have been an individual question, probably.
Roger, how much do you think the Quakers in Germany at that time, with the rise of the Nazi regime, how much they spoke of and knew? How much was this is coming, friends, type of thing, and were they able to, were they strong enough to influence anything like that, or were they still kind of a small disparate groups?
They were a very small group. Probably, I think at the maximum, their members were about 400, and I think less by the time of the war, because some didn't stay. So there was a wider body of friends, but it was still a very small. I mean, considering the size of Germany, it was a very tiny operation. So their political influence was, on the face of it, pretty remote, pretty slender. While you're thinking about that, I'm afraid I must excuse myself for a moment. I'll be back in a minute.
Is your sound quality any better, Patsy? Is that you're muted, my dear?
It's very good. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yes, I'm keeping it turned off, except at this moment. in case that's what it is.
Okay.
Well, I'd just like to say it's an aside, but there's absolutely no doubt about it in my mind. I'm here today because my grandfather, who served in the British Army and was injured in 1915, it was the Friends Ambulance Unit, which was incredibly well organised, that would have got him back. Well, he didn't. He was born in Aden actually, but got him to England and saved his life and enabled him to get married and have my dad. I did some work on it. I mean, in April 1915, the Friends Ambulance Unit had inoculated 20,000 people against typhoid fever. They had supplied water for 15,000 people obviously in the area around Belgium. Incredible. And they had got the ambulance unit organized 4 days after World War I started. I mean, incredibly impressive organizational structures that you don't read about much, but it certainly was. That is an aspect of Quakers, it seems to me.
Angela was just speaking of the Friend Ambulance, Roger.
Indeed, yeah. My father didn't join until early 1915, but
oh, okay. So here we are. What your father was doing in, I don't know whether you can see it, in 1915 was incredible. There was ambulance units and incredible work, inoculating people against typhoid fever, which was a real problem in Belgium, and giving fresh water to people in Belgium. Incredible work.
Yeah,
incredible work.
He worked in the hospital behind the lines at Ypres.
Oh, really? This is Ypres. My grandfather. Well, my grandfather was in the war, and he injured his hand. I mean, had him in hospital for 7 weeks. It sounds as though this hand injury was not just a little tickle; it was fairly serious. But the Friends Ambulance Unit was impressive organisation.
It was, wasn't it? He was there for a year, and he alternated. He had a month in the hospital, a month driving ambulances.
So he might have saved my grandfather's life then.
Could well have done, yes.
Got him back to Red Marley, which is somewhere in Wales.
But of course, then the Military Service Act came in, and many of them felt that they were becoming too identified with the army, and came home, caught a catch ball, of course, went to prison. But my father was able to get conditional exemption, and he worked for the German emergency. Although he was still in the FAU, he worked for the German Emergency Committee then until 1919. I think he probably worked at the internment camp at Alexandra Palace, because somebody's done research on the woman he married, who was not my mother, he was first wife, who died in the flu epidemic in 1919. But she worked there, so I think it's quite likely that's where he worked, because that's where he would have met her.
Returning to your piece for this morning, Roger.
That's right. Anyway, anyone got any more questions on the neutral stance? So let's now move on to the final one, the reconciliation, which of course is related. There's still this sense of equal-handedness, and the question is the I mean, this applies more widely to, of course, peace activity in this country, which isn't part of my research, so I don't have anything particular to say about it. But the question is did the Quaker position contribute to appeasement, and was that the wrong thing to be associated with? And the question that Bertha Bracey asked, were we right to play down the atrocities? But the alternative, of course, was there more covert resistance to the values of a regime seen in their practical activities, the right use of their talents and resources? So another of those dilemmas for Quakers of how you operate in the real world, and how do you face up to the reality of evil when you actually believe in the spark of the divine? Quite difficult. It's very difficult to see the spark of the divine in Hitler.
I think it was quenched quite early on in his life, but yeah, I think on appeasement, we need to remember in the broader, I mean, I think our view looking back on the Second World War is what Churchill made it to a certain extent. But I mean, appeasement was very, very popular. You know, I don't think it was an accident that Chamberlain was on the balcony at Buckingham Palace with the King and Queen when he brought back the Munich Agreement, which, we now feel was, a mistake. So, but yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it, on the reporting on incidents thing, because are they going to pick on you next of all? And one always gets the impression that we didn't know much in this country about the dreadful things that were happening, but I don't actually know how true that is. But it's a bit like, if you're watching Al Jazeera news at present, you get perhaps 10 minutes on the rest of the world. The rest of the time it's in Gaza. Whereas I found once or twice with one of the national services, you get possibly 2 minutes on Gaza. There are more interesting things going on now, so would it have been reported even if it was, if the stories were told? Don't know.
I don't know sufficiently what the. I mean, would need quite a substantial survey of the British press, I suppose, to get a feeling of that in the 30s. But I mean, of course, the big problem with appeasement is that it meant somebody else was paying, and the Munich Agreement is a very clear example of that. The Czechs paid for our unwillingness to, as a country, I'm not talking as friends, as a country, to stand up against German ambitions in Czechoslovakia, and of course the other thing is of course that the fact that, for example, the failure of the Allies to prevent the reoccupation of the Rhineland. I don't know, I'm not a historian, but I can imagine that it wouldn't be too difficult to trace from that to sort of an emboldenment of Hitler's military ambitions, because he felt that in the end the Allies weren't going to stop him. My understanding, and this is a very much sort of shallow and not at all well founded, but I've got the impression that even in September 39, Hitler was hoping that Britain would stay out of the war and wouldn't challenge his incursion into Poland, because that's what had been happening. So in retrospect, it could easily be argued that appeasement made a big contribution to the Second World War. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that Hitler's ambitions were there and would have come out somehow, and but of course, by the time he invaded Russia, the British weren't having very much effect militarily. So it's so that doesn't. But and of course, he didn't expect the Americans to come in. He thought the Americans were going to be isolationist, which they would have been probably apart if it hadn't been for Pearl Harbor.
Some historians have made that rather hackneyed, I think, comment that the Second World War was a continuation of the First World War.
Indeed.
That the kind of nearly the Belle Epoque eras were that you can nearly see that in films like Christopher Isherwood's books, along the lines of that, and the film. I forget the name of the film now. It had a woman in it called Sally Bowles, who was the kind of the rise of Germany, and it ended with the young Nazi youth lad singing "Tomorrow Belongs to Me," and that type of thing, and it's that slowly kind of attrition and things moving on in that way. We can see them now as part of history, but to be there and to be within that, who would speak out?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a fascinating period, as well as being horrible. I mean, there were voices in 1919 whose response, people who actually involved in the Versailles negotiations, who said, "We'll be back here," and of course they were back within 20 years. The Quaker position, sort of epitomized by Quaker Catchpole, was a big concern about the effect of reparations and the war guilt label, particularly reparations, and gradually that the sanctions and the reparations became less significant in the 30s. But by that time, it was too late. The damage was done. And the easing of reparations was probably seen as a weakness by the German regime, I would guess. The behavior of the Allies in the 20s was pretty punitive, and created great bitterness. So one can see the seeds of it all. Quaker Catchpole wrote a very thoughtful and interesting reflection in 1933 on the Nazi Revolution, which he saw as pretty well inevitable. Carl Heath was a bit critical of it because he felt that he'd missed some important things about that and was perhaps too favourable to the Nazi. He was too ready to accept that the case put by the regime over these atrocities are short-term necessities. There are things we have to do because we're in a revolution, and it won't last. Well, of course it did, and I think Corder could be accused of naivety at that point. And Carl Heath very wisely takes him to task over that. Won't let him publish the article, or discourages him from publishing it, and he doesn't. But it's a very interesting read. An important bit of material in the FSC archives, which I found very interesting and hope to get back to reading more detail. So it's a very sad situation, and the contribution that a small body like Quakers can make is obviously going to be pretty limited. There are one or two contributions which stand out as having had a big impact. One, of course, was the child feeding scheme in the 1920s, and the other is the kinder transport, which Quakers played a big part in. It doesn't get an enormous amount of publicity, but then that's how Quakers operate. We don't blow our own trumpet. But it's not surprising that in 1947, British and American Quakers were given the Nobel Prize, which, for the relief and reconstruction in the wars in between them.
Does Erica want to say something again? She's unmuted her iPad.
Chris, Tony, I did put my hand up. Roger, in your researches...
Sorry, say again?
Can you hear me?
You broke up for a moment.
Oh, sorry. In your researches, what is the actual evidence that the Quakers, as you put it, played down the atrocities? Is that written up, or is it simply that there is no written evidence that they raised?
Well, I mean, the evidence I have is that remark of Bertha Brace's, because she was a fairly crucial person. She was the secretary of the FSC committee, and I imagine that she was pretty close to what British Quakers were saying. Those who knew what was happening in Germany, because she was the contact for the FSC representative in London. I mean, I've just been reading their correspondence, which is variably useful, shall we say. It's got a lot of dross in it, as far as I'm concerned. It led me to focusing on these issues that I've just identified today, of the motivation, what was motivating Quakers, and the strands in that motivation that I used to structure what I had to say today. But she was certainly very close to it, and she traveled a lot in Germany. She spent quite a lot of time in Germany in the 20s, and also traveled quite a lot during the 30s in her role as the secretary of the committee, visiting the Quaker outposts. So she's a pretty fundamental person. Well, I could go on about it for quite a long time. A very remarkable human being, along with a number of others who played big roles. Anyway, well, we're past 12 o'clock. So unless anyone got last questions, Chris, sorry, Ray.
When you have finished your research, I don't know how long that will take.
Good question.
But I hope we can invite you to come back and speak of it.
Indeed. Yeah, I will be very glad to. Thank you very much. No, the time scale is that, in theory, my present two-year part-time course finishes in September in the coming year, but I'm about to take 6 months leave of absence because I'm having a hip replacement in January.
Good.
And that 6 months, continuing with support from my supervisor, who happens to be one Ben Dandelion, I hope to catch up on some of my work on the archives, which is quite time consuming. And I'm certainly running behind. And it's quite possible that I still won't finish by September plus 6 months, by March in 25. And if I haven't finished, I have another 2 years available to me to carry on. The absolute deadline is 4 years, so it might take a little while. But I'm hoping to get it finished within the original deadline, which will be, as I say, March 25. After which, one thing that came to me so clearly, and it's obviously coloured what I had to say today, is that you can't really consider Quaker activity in the 30s without seeing the background. And what I think hasn't been written up is the sort of overall history. The number of bits of it have been written up. The overall history of Quaker involvement in Germany from 1919 onwards. Hans Schmidt gives it from the German point of view, but I want to put it from the British point of view. And so my plan, if I'm given the time, is to write a book. So we'll be very glad to come and talk to you again. I hope to get some ideas of things that I need to focus on in my book. But I've got other things. I've got to get the MSc, the masters finished first. MA it is. I thought it was going to be an MPhil, but it turns out to be an MA. Not that it makes any difference. And it's it'll be interesting to see whether I manage to make something of it. But I'm getting some sense of format. I've got a framework which I'm about to rewrite my introduction with, including the ideas that I've been sharing today. So thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you, Roger. As I said in the introduction, a fascinating hour for us all. Next week, we have another of little vinaigrettes, I may say, of friends who will come and speak of their life. We've had 2 so far, which has been myself, David Saunders. Next week, we have the warden of Quaker Meeting House, Charles Gamble, who, as his major friend, I've chatted to him often about life and all this other thing. A fascinating man. So please, if you can spare us the hour, come along. You will not be disappointed. As I also say, tell your meeting, tell your friends, tell the cat. Everybody is welcome on Friday mornings. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And have a good day.
Thanks for joining us.